All right, so are you ready to dig into this?
Absolutely.
Because today we're diving into the career of a baseball player. You might not know Eddie Fisher.
Interesting choice.
And no, we're not talking about the singer Eddie Fisher.
Right.
This Eddie Fisher was a pitcher. And you know what? He was a knuckleballer.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so you sent over some articles about him, and honestly, I got to say I was fascinated. I mean, not a Hall of Famer or anything,
Yeah.
but his career is full of these like little twists and turns and interesting moments.
Yeah.
So let's see if we can figure out like what made Eddie Fisher so unique, and why is he worth remembering?
Well, I think what's really fascinating about Eddie Fisher is his career really shows us how the role of the reliever was changing, especially in the 60s, when he was in his prime.
Okay, so like set the scene for us a little bit.
Mhm.
We know he was a knuckleballer, which is already pretty unusual for a pitcher.
Yeah.
So where did it all begin for him? Where does he come from?
Well, his path to the majors was kind of like a lot of players back then. Wasn't straightforward. He was born in Louisiana, but he was raised in Oklahoma and then eventually signed by the New York Giants.
Giants, yeah.
Yeah. And back then, like, teams had these huge scouting networks, always on the lookout for talent.
Right.
And, Fisher was kind of a diamond in the rough, I guess you could say.
So he makes it to the Giants in '59.
Right.
But it sounds like from what I read, he wasn't like an instant star or
You know,
anything.
Not right away, but he was part of a big trade in the 61-62 offseason.
A trade.
Yeah, the Giants, they sent him to the White Sox along with a few other players, but in exchange, they got Billy Pierce and Don Larson.
Whoa, hold on.
Yeah.
Traded for Billy Pierce and Don Larson.
Yeah.
I mean, those are huge names in baseball.
They're established stars, yeah.
So that's got to be a lot of pressure for a young player, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like, hey, we just traded you for these two legends, so no pressure, but like perform.
Yeah, exactly.
So how did he handle that move to the White Sox?
He actually handled it incredibly well, and that's where his career takes a really interesting turn because he becomes this like dominant reliever for the White Sox. I mean, we're talking 4 straight seasons pitching over 120 innings each with an ERA under 4.0.
Wait, 4 straight seasons?
Right.
With that kind of workload?
Yeah,
That doesn't sound typical for relievers back then, or am I wrong?
you're right. It wasn't typical at all. See, back then, relievers were often seen as like failed starters,
Interesting.
not as like specialists with these defined roles like we have today.
I see.
So to like put it into perspective, imagine a closer today pitching 3 or 4 innings multiple times a week.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
It just wouldn't happen.
No, not at all.
So Fisher's performance really kind of challenges how people thought about relievers in the 60s because he wasn't just eating up innings, he was consistently good.
So then we get to 1965, and this season seems like it was a really big deal for him.
Yeah.
I mean, his ERA was 2.4 years. He had 82
Yeah.
appearances.
Yeah.
A WHIP of .974. I mean, 82 appearances.
It's incredible.
Even today with all the specialized relievers we have, that's a crazy number.
It is.
So what was the thinking back then? Why was he used so much?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? It was just a different game. Managers used their best pitchers differently. They relied on these workhorses like Fisher,
I guess so.
and he delivered, And that 65 season was really a turning point for him, but also for how people saw relievers. He got his only all-star selection that year.
An all-star selection.
Yeah, and one of the articles mentioned that he finished 4th in the MVP voting that year.
Really? 4th for MVP?
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, that's almost unthinkable for a reliever even now.
It is. To put it in perspective, he finished behind Zoilo Versalles, who won the MVP that year,
Right.
and 2 future Hall of Famers, Tony Oliva and Brooks Robinson.
Wow.
So that really says something about how much impact he had on the game. He wasn't just a guy eating up innings, he was a game changer.
Yeah, I see that.
Yeah.
So he's coming off this incredible season in Chicago. And then what happens? He gets traded to the Orioles right in the middle of the 66 season.
Right, and it's with the Orioles that he wins a World Series ring.
He does. But he didn't actually pitch in the World Series, did he?
No, he didn't. The Orioles swept the Dodgers with 3 complete game shutouts.
It's kind of ironic in a way, right?
Yeah.
You have this dominant reliever, and he ends up on a team that doesn't even need their bullpen in the World Series.
Right.
Does that take away from his achievement at all?
Not at all. Being part of a championship team, no matter how much you played in the series, is the ultimate goal in baseball.
Yeah, that's true.
It cements his legacy, and it shows that the Orioles knew how valuable he was. They wanted him on that championship team.
Right. Okay, so he wins a World Series, but his career keeps going after that, right?
Oh, yeah. He goes on to pitch for the California Angels.
Oh, wow.
and then even returns to the White Sox. I mean, think about it. His career lasted 15 seasons.
15 seasons.
Oh,
That's incredible.
it really shows you how durable he was, how consistent he was, and how he could adapt to different teams and different roles.
Absolutely. Speaking of the White Sox, there was something in one of those articles you sent that caught my eye. It was in the comments, actually,
Oh, yeah.
on an MLB trade rumors post. Someone mentioned that Fisher was part of a bullpen with 3 knuckleballers in Chicago.
Wow.
3 knuckleballers.
That's so rare. You almost never see that in baseball history.
I can only imagine what it must have been like for the catchers.
Right. Catching for one knuckleballer is hard enough.
Yeah, but 3.
It makes you wonder why a team would even try that, you know? What were they hoping to achieve?
Yeah, like were they just like, let's throw a bunch of knuckleballers out there and see what happens?
Maybe. But it shows you the mystique of the knuckleball, right? Like the belief that it could mess with hitters' timing and create chaos.
It definitely sounds chaotic.
It does.
Yeah.
So did it work? Was that 3 knuckleballer bullpen successful? It's hard to say for sure. There's not a lot of data from back then. But just the idea of it is pretty amazing.
It is. It really is. It makes you think about how much the game has changed.
Yeah.
Like today, with everyone focused on velocity and spin rate, would any team even consider having 1 knuckleballer in their bullpen, let alone 3?
It's hard to imagine.
Right.
Teams today are so focused on data and analytics,
Yeah.
and the knuckleball is all about unpredictability. It's seen as too risky, too unreliable.
So in a way, Eddie Fisher represents like a lost art in baseball.
I guess you could say that the knuckleball is still thrown sometimes, but it's become this novelty, almost a relic of a different era.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's like we've lost that element of surprise in the game.
It makes you wonder if Eddie Fisher were coming up today, would he have even been allowed to develop his knuckleball?
Right. Would coaches have seen his potential, or would they have tried to make him into a more traditional pitcher?
Exactly. It's hard to know.
One thing's for sure, though. He wouldn't have been part of a 3 knuckleballer bullpen.
Definitely not. But that's part of what makes his story so interesting, right? He played in a different era.
Yeah.
A time when the game was changing, when there was more room for trying new things and for players who were unique.
You know, it's funny. I keep thinking about that story about Eddie Fisher getting hate mail meant for the singer.
Oh, yeah.
That must have been so frustrating for him.
It must have been. But it also kind of highlights the difference between the two Eddie Fishers, right?
Right.
One was a huge celebrity, always in the spotlight, always surrounded by drama.
Yeah.
And the other one was a baseball player, a grinder, someone who just quietly did his job and did it well.
He was a master of his craft, even though that craft involved a pitch that seems to defy logic.
Exactly. And he was successful, too, more than most players ever dream of.
Yeah, you're right. A 15-year career, an all-star selection, a World Series ring. Those are huge accomplishments.
They really are. And it makes you appreciate how unique Eddie Fisher's path to success was.
It does. Okay, so we've talked about how Eddie Fisher is more than just a footnote in baseball history.
Right.
But to really understand his impact, I think we need to talk more about what made him so special, the knuckleball.
Definitely. Let's dive into that. The knuckleball, it's just such a weird pitch, right? Like, it's this beautiful anomaly in baseball.
It is, yeah.
It goes against everything you think you know about pitching, like velocity and spin.
Right.
And for Eddie Fisher, it was like his key to this long and successful career.
So break it down for us a little bit. How does a knuckleball actually work? And what made Fisher so good at it?
Okay, so imagine a baseball coming towards you, but it's barely spinning, almost like it's floating.
Okay.
That's a knuckleball. It's thrown with almost no rotation, which means it moves because of the air hitting it and the seams of the ball.
Huh?
It can dip, it can dart, it can rise, it can basically do anything.
Really?
And it's unpredictable even for the pitcher throwing it.
No wonder catchers had such a hard time with it, especially back then with those tiny gloves they used.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Can you imagine trying to catch that thing? But for hitters, it's a nightmare. They have no idea when to swing. They can't predict where it's going. It's like a guessing game every time.
Wow.
And Eddie Fisher, he was a master of that deception. He could make that ball dance.
And remember, he was part of that 3 knuckleballer bullpen in Chicago.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Got to talk about that more. Why would the White Sox do that? Go with this crazy strategy of 3 knuckleballers?
It's kind of a mystery, to be honest. But maybe they thought it would give them an edge, you know? Confuse the hitters. Keep in mind, this was before teams were using all the analytics and data they use now.
Right.
So maybe they were more willing to just try something different.
Like Hey, let's see if this works.
Right. It shows you the mystique of the knuckleball, this idea that it could completely disrupt hitters and create chaos.
Did it work, though? Was that three-knuckleballer bullpen actually successful?
It's tough to say. There's not a ton of information about it, but I bet it was a wild thing to watch.
It would have been amazing to see that.
It really would. It definitely adds to the legend of Eddie Fisher.
It does. You know, thinking about how much the game has changed now with all the focus on velocity and spin rate,
Yeah.
would any team today even think about having a knuckleballer in their bullpen, let alone three?
It's hard to see it happening.
Right.
Teams now are all about data and scouting reports. The knuckleball is like the opposite of that. It's all about unpredictability.
Yeah.
Teams see it as too risky.
So is it fair to say that Eddie Fisher represents this, like, lost art in baseball?
Yeah, in a way, I think so. The knuckleball is still around, but it's rare. It's like this relic from a different time.
It's kind of sad in a way.
Yeah, it is. We've lost that element of surprise.
What do you think? If Eddie Fisher was coming up through the minors today, would he have even been allowed to develop his knuckleball?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Would coaches have seen his potential? Or would they have tried to change him into a more conventional pitcher?
It's hard to say.
It really is. But one thing's for sure, he wouldn't have been part of a three-knuckleballer bullpen.
Definitely not. But that's what makes his story so fascinating, right? He played in a different time.
Exactly. When things were more experimental,
Heck,
when there was more room for players who were different.
you know, I keep thinking about that story about Eddie Fisher getting all that hate mail that was actually meant for the singer.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic.
That must have been so annoying.
It must have. But it also shows the difference between the two Eddie Fishers, right?
Right.
One was this famous celebrity, always in the spotlight, always surrounded by drama.
Yeah.
And the other was a baseball player, a hard worker, who just went out and did his job quietly and effectively.
He was a master of his craft, even if that craft was this pitch that seemed to defy all logic.
I know, right? And he was successful, too. He achieved more than most players could ever hope for.
A 15-year career, an all-star appearance, a World Series ring. That's amazing.
It is. It really shows you how special Eddie Fisher was.
Okay, so we talked about how Eddie Fisher is more than just a forgotten name in baseball history.
Right.
But to really get him, I think we need to dive deeper into what made him so unique, the knuckleball.
Absolutely. Let's go.
You know, it's really cool how looking at just one player's career can show us so much about how baseball itself changed over time.
It really is. And Eddie Fisher's story is like a bridge between these different eras of baseball.
It is, yeah.
He starts out in the late 50s when baseball was, all about tradition.
Yeah.
And then he plays all the way through the 70s when things were changing like crazy.
Right.
Think about it. He was playing during the expansion era when all these new teams joined the league and new stadiums were being built. And there was this like wave of new talent coming into the game.
Wow. So he was right there in the middle of this like huge shift in baseball.
He was new rivalries, new challenges, a whole new world of possibilities.
I bet he had some crazy stories from those days.
I'm sure he did.
Oh,
It
yeah.
makes you wish we had more stories from players like him,
Yeah.
guys who lived through that era when the game was changing so much. But even without those stories, we can kind of put the pieces together,
Right.
Through these articles, you shared these glimpses into his career, the comments from fans who saw him play.
It's like we're time travelers using these little bits of information to understand a whole different era of baseball.
It is. And Eddie Fisher with his knuckleball and his like quiet determination,
Yeah,
he kind of helps us connect to that past.
he does. And his story also makes you think about the game today and where it's going.
Right?
The way relievers are used now, the focus on data and analytics, the obsession with velocity and spin rate,
Yep.
it's a world away from what Eddie Fisher experienced.
It really is.
If he was trying to make it in the majors today, would he even get the chance to develop his knuckleball?
That's a good question. The knuckleball is practically extinct in today's game.
It is. It really makes you wonder about how we find and develop talent.
Yeah, do we overlook unique skills sometimes because we're too focused on what's popular or what's easy to measure?
Right. Could there be another Eddie Fisher out there somewhere?
Maybe a kid who's got this amazing knack for the knuckleball, but he just needs someone to give him a chance.
Imagine that, right? It would be amazing to see someone come along and shake things up, bring back a little bit of that old school magic.
It would. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the life and career of Eddie Fisher, I think we've come away with a much better understanding of how baseball has changed over the years.
I agree.
The role of relievers, the different ways teams think about pitching strategy, and most importantly, the importance of recognizing and celebrating the unique talents that have shaped this game.
Exactly. He might not be a household name, but Eddie Fisher's story reminds us that baseball is about more than just stats and highlights.
It's about the people who played the game, the characters who made it come alive, and the legacy they leave behind.
Well said.
Eddie Fisher, the knuckleballing All-Star World Series champion, and part of that unforgettable three-knuckleballer bullpen.
What a story.
A fascinating career, a unique talent, and a story definitely worth remembering.